John Warne Gates had a rocky start to life. After losing both his brothers, he felt trapped in his hometown, even though that same feeling was what got his siblings killed in the first place. But when a traveling salesman position presented itself, he jumped at the opportunity, unaware of just how much it would change his life. But despite his success in selling barbed wire to the many ranchers of Texas, Gates had an issue. In making all of his money, he developed a severe gambling addiction, spending nearly every free moment on wagers, whether it was at the poker table, the horse races, or even just betting on which train would arrive first to the station. Although his affluence cushioned him for most of his life, eventually he would become his own downfall. This is the story of John Bet a Million Gates, and this is Learn Something New. When John was growing up, his family life had never really been the best. His oldest brother had run away from home when John was 6 to fight in the Civil War, but eventually succumbed to his wounds in the Battle of New Hope Church just 6 years later. His other brother Gilbert left the family farm wanting to head west, picking up a hitchhiker along the trail named Alexander Jester, who shortly after would go on to murder him and steal his wagon. This obviously didn't sit well with John or his father Asel, who hired investigators to track down Jester, finding and arresting him in Mexico, Missouri. But Jester would escape from jail before the duo could confront him. This devastated John so much so that he vowed vengeance for his brother's death. But before he ever got the chance, Jester would be found dead in Norman, Oklahoma in 1904. In the meantime, Gates was keeping busy with the family farm, something he absolutely loathed, often taking off in the afternoon to hunt for squirrels in the nearby woods. And it was here that he would devise his first business plan. Gates found a patch of prime timber that could be used for everything from houses to railroads. He managed to convince his mother to give him money and approached the owner of the land, offering to buy trees off of him so that he could remove them. Once the owner agreed, John decided that he no longer felt like cutting the trees down, opting instead to get 3 of his peers in the local community to do it for him. By the time it was all cleared, John had earned $1,000, all without cutting down a single tree himself. From here, he became enthralled with the idea of making money, starting a threshing business, then becoming a broker for grain and corn farmers who were shipping their crops through the area. Some of these businesses saw minor success, but John would experience a lot of failure. It seemed to him that no matter how hard he tried, nobody wanted to trust a 17-year-old with their business. But he was increasingly feeling trapped on the family farm. Desperate for an escape, he would play poker in the town whenever he could. And he found that he was quite good at it, often able to offset his losses in his brokering business with his poker gains. However, eventually he could no longer justify his business and closed it down, pivoting to opening a hardware store instead in 1875. But there was a new opportunity on the horizon that would change Gates' life forever. Just a few years earlier, and 38 miles west of Gates, a farmer was devising a way to keep his livestock from wandering off his land. Joseph Glidden had seen an early design of Henry Rose's single-stranded barbed wire at the local county fair, and believed that he could make it better, using 2 strands of wire instead of 1 and twisting them together to keep them in place. And on October 27, 1873, Glidden submitted an application to the U.S. Patent Office, with many throughout the Great Plains quickly realizing that his wire was the cheapest, strongest, and most durable way to fence their property. By 1874, the aging Glidden sold off his interest for $60,000, selling his interest over to Charles Washburn and Philip Moen, who knew that they needed an army of salesmen to get as much of the wire into the hands of farmers as possible. So when a traveler came to town and told Gates of the opportunity to become a salesman selling barbed wire to farmers, the young John saw it as a way to fix his financial woes, but also to get as far away from his hometown as possible. He sold his share of the hardware store for $700 and left for the barbed wire factory. Once there, he saw the steam machines churning out tons of barbed wire, and began to realize just how big of an operation this was going to become. He was hired for the role for $30 a month. Before long, he was on a train, heading for Texas. Soon after arriving, he met with dozens of ranchers, none of whom would even consider his proposal for barbed wire. The ranchers didn't trust that the wire was anywhere near good enough to stop a single cow from breaking through, meaning it simply wasn't worth the cost. Gates only survived during this time off his ability to dominate nearly any poker game he entered. But even he knew that it was risky to rely on poker games for a living. He had had downturns before, and he didn't have enough to weather one now. He needed a way to show the farmers of Texas that barbed wire could work. And it was during a traveling medicine show where a fake doctor was selling snake oil medicine that he claimed could cure everything from the common cold to collapsed lungs that he came up with a solution. Gates used the last of his money to put on a rodeo in San Antonio, Texas, which would bring in ranchers from all across the state. Gates acted in a level of showmanship he had learned from the snake oil salesman, putting up barbed wire on the perimeter. He advertised that the cattle there would be some of the toughest and wildest in all of Texas. Then he went out and found some of the most gentle cattle he came across. At the end of the rodeo, Gates announced that for the grand finale, he was going to provoke a stampede of his 60 cattle. They ran up against the wire he had set up, but never broke through. Everything changed after this point. Gates began doing the rodeo every week, and the only worry he had now was if the factory he visited could produce enough wire to satisfy the rancher's insatiable need. His luck had completely reversed. Ranchers were firing their cowboys so they could afford more wire, and Gates was beginning to rake in the money. Money that was increasingly being spent on betting in cards, horses, and any other wager he could take on, with rumors circulating that he would bet random passerbys at train stations $1,000 on whether the train would come first from the east or the west. His first bet on a horse was for $1,000, and once it won, he received $5,000. But despite things going well for Gates, he grew restless, thinking the owners back in Illinois were taking advantage of his skills, especially as they refused to give him anything more than a slight raise in his commissions, and wouldn't entertain his ideas of building a barbed wire manufacturing plant down in the South. This eventually got so bad that it led to him quitting his high-performing career, choosing to move instead to St. Louis, Missouri, to form his own barbed wire company to compete with his former employer. Gates started and grew the Southern Wire Company out of St. Louis, and after a series of mergers and acquisitions, eventually J.P. Morgan came knocking on his door seeking a merger with his company into U.S. Steel, on the explicit condition that Gates have no part in the business after the merger. Because by the early 1900s, Gates had found that his reputation often preceded him. As he had made more money, his attitude toward gambling became more and more extreme, frequently holding high-stakes poker games anywhere he went, from his suite at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City to his yacht. One of these games once lasted 5 days straight, with $2 million changing hands. In 1900, on a trip to England, Gates bet $70,000 on a horse and won. His winnings totaled up over $600,000. Though, like many of his winnings, this was exaggerated in its retellings, eventually to $1 million, earning him his hated nickname of Bet-A-Million. People thought little of Gates for his behaviors, but most at least tolerated him. So when J.P. Morgan wanted to cut him out of the business, he became so infuriated that he would scheme for the rest of his life to take the man down. Though none of these would ever succeed. He would meet his end under the knife in Paris in 1911, passing away as doctors attempted to remove a tumor from his throat. Though many prominent people disliked him, his funeral saw crowds travel from Texas, specifically from the town of Port Arthur, where he had contributed a fortune to its development, funding many of the businesses there and turning it into a major Gulf port city. As for his gambling, he never quite got past the habit, especially given that it was a major part of his life philosophy, saying, "Life is a gamble. Everything is a gamble. When the farmer plants his corn, he is gambling. He is betting that the weather conditions will help him raise a good crop. Sometimes he loses, sometimes he wins. Whenever a man starts out on a railway journey, it's a gamble if he'll ever get where he's going. You see, all life is a gamble." Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Or if you want, you can check out the channel's Patreon, linked below in the description. Special thanks to the channel's patrons, but as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.